You've seen it activate 100 times. A character's calm dark eyes suddenly bleed into red. Black shapes spin into place around the pupil. Time seems to slow down around them. They read your fists before you throw them, copy techniques after watching them once, and see things no ordinary eye could ever catch. It looks like the ultimate advantage. But if the Sharingan were actually real, grafted into an actual human skull, the truth is far stranger and far more dangerous than the show ever let on. Because the eye that lets you see everything might be the exact thing that destroys you first. Let's start with what the Sharingan claims to do. It grants heightened visual perception, the ability to track fast movement, predict an opponent's next move, and copy complex physical techniques just by watching them. Strip away the fictional chakra for a moment. Ask yourself the more grounded question underneath all of it. What would it actually take for a human eye and brain to process information at that speed? Your eyes are not passive cameras. They're extensions of your brain, and your brain is the most metabolically expensive organ you own. At rest, your brain consumes roughly 20% of your body's total energy, despite making up only about 2% of your body weight. Neuroscientist Marcus Rachel, whose decades of research at Washington University in St. Louis helped map how the resting brain burns fuel, has shown that even when you're doing nothing, your brain is running an enormous background bill just to keep itself online. Now imagine asking that same organ to process visual information dramatically faster than normal. Where would that extra processing power come from? The honest answer is nowhere good. Human vision already runs close to its physical ceiling. Your eyes send about 10 million bits of raw visual data to your brain every single second, and your visual cortex, the region at the back of your skull responsible for interpreting that data, is already working near full capacity just to produce the ordinary experience of seeing a room. Ramping that up further wouldn't be like turning a dial. It would be like overclocking a processor that's already running hot, except this processor is made of living tissue that generates real heat as a byproduct. Which brings you to the first problem the Sharingan would create: heat. Sustained neural overactivity produces measurable temperature increases in brain tissue, and your skull is not built to dissipate heat quickly. A study on traumatic brain injury and neural stress, led by researchers studying metabolic strain in overactive neurons, found that prolonged high-frequency firing in localized brain regions can push local tissue temperature high enough to damage the very cells doing the firing. Your brain is essentially a wet, densely packed circuit board, cooled slowly by blood flow, not by fans. Push the visual processing centers into overdrive for extended fights and you're not activating a superpower. You're running a localized fever inside your own skull. Now think about what the show depicts every single time the Sharingan is used for long stretches. Nosebleeds, exhaustion, characters collapsing afterward, sometimes temporarily blinded. The story already knows something is wrong with this ability. It just frames the cost as chakra depletion instead of what it would actually be, which is your own brain cooking itself from the inside while you desperately try to win a fight. But heat isn't even the strangest part. There's a second cost hiding inside the seeing everything fantasy, and it's about how memory actually works. The Sharingan is often described as being able to memorize and copy a technique after watching it once. That sounds like a superpower, but ask yourself what memorization actually requires biologically. Neuroscientist Eric Kandel, whose Nobel Prize-winning work on memory formation reshaped how scientists understand learning, demonstrated that forming a lasting memory requires physical structural changes at the level of individual synapses, the connection points between neurons. This isn't instantaneous. It takes time, repetition, and in many cases, sleep for those structural changes to consolidate and stick. A single glance at a complex physical technique wouldn't just need faster eyes. It would need synapses capable of restructuring themselves in a fraction of a second over and over every time the ability activates. There is no known biological mechanism that allows that. And if there somehow were, you'd have another problem entirely. Because memory doesn't work like empty storage waiting to be filled. Every new memory competes for the same neural real estate the brain already uses for something else. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If you could genuinely memorize a complex, high-speed martial arts sequence with a single glance every single time you used that ability, what would be getting overwritten or crowded out to make room? The show never asks that question because doing so would break the fantasy. But this is exactly the kind of trade-off real neuroscience keeps running into. Your brain isn't a limitless hard drive. It's a finite, densely wired structure constantly making trade-offs between what it keeps and what it lets fade. Before you get to that third problem, there's something worth pausing on because the show frames the Sharingan as something you're simply born with, passed down through bloodline. And strangely, that part isn't as fictional as it sounds. Real human eyes already carry an enormous amount of inherited variation most people never think about. Genetic researcher Hazel Rossati's foundational work on eye pigmentation, later expanded by modern genome studies, has shown that iris color and structure are governed by a surprisingly complex set of genes, not the simple single-gene trait many people were taught in school. Eye color alone can be influenced by more than a dozen interacting genes, which is part of why siblings from the same parents can end up with visibly different eyes. So the idea of an inherited rare eye mutation isn't where the science breaks down. Bloodline traits like this happen constantly in nature. Heterochromia, where a person has two different colored eyes, is a real, well-documented genetic and sometimes medical condition. The Sharingan's core premise, a family-specific ocular trait passed through generations, sits closer to plausible biology than almost anything else about it. The problem was never the inheritance, it's what the ability supposedly does once it's inherited. Which brings you to that third and perhaps even more brutal problem, the one the anime accidentally gets closest to acknowledging honestly. Every major use of the Sharingan in its more advanced forms comes with visible physical damage to the eye itself. Blood vessels bursting, vision degrading. Characters eventually needing transplants just to keep seeing at all. That detail isn't just dramatic flavor, it's actually the most scientifically plausible part of the entire ability. The retina, the light-sensitive tissue lining the back of your eye, is fed by extremely delicate blood vessels that are notoriously vulnerable to pressure changes and oxidative stress. Ophthalmology research on retinal vascular strain has consistently shown that sudden spikes in blood flow demand, the kind you'd need to power a dramatically enhanced visual processing system, are one of the fastest ways to cause microtears and hemorrhaging in exactly this tissue. Doctors see versions of this in real patients whose retinas are pushed past their limits by extreme blood pressure spikes, and the damage is rarely something that fully reverses. So paradoxically, the one part of this fictional power that would actually happen to a real human body is the part the show already shows you: bleeding eyes, deteriorating vision, a power that visibly consumes the very organ producing it. Before you get to time, there's still the matter of prediction itself, the idea that a trained Sharingan user can read an opponent's next move before it happens. This one, unlike the others, actually has a real foundation in neuroscience, at least in a limited form. Neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti's research on what are now called mirror neurons showed that certain brain cells fire both when you perform an action and when you simply watch someone else perform it. Experienced martial artists, dancers, and athletes show measurably stronger mirror neuron activation when watching movements within their own discipline, which is part of why a skilled fighter really can anticipate a strike a fraction of a second before it lands, just from subtle shifts in an opponent's shoulders or weight. So the core idea isn't fantasy. Elite athletes across boxing, fencing, and tennis genuinely do develop faster anticipatory reflexes through repetition, and sports scientists have measured these gains directly using reaction time studies. A professional tennis player can return a serve traveling well over 100 miles an hour, not because their raw reflexes are superhuman, but because years of exposure have trained their brain to predict trajectory before the ball leaves the opponent's racket. But here's where the Sharingan pulls away from reality. That kind of prediction takes years to build, sport by sport, motion by motion. It's narrow, specific, and earned slowly through repetition. The Sharingan promises the same ability instantly, universally against any technique, from any opponent the very first time it's seen. Real anticipatory skill is the product of a brain rewiring itself gradually through thousands of repeated exposures. There's no biological shortcut that replaces that timeline with a single glance, no matter how enhanced the eye doing the looking might be. There's one more piece of the fantasy worth taking seriously because it's probably the detail that made you fall in love with this ability in the first place. The sense that time itself slows down, that a punch which would normally blur past you instead arrives frame by frame, easy to read, easy to dodge. You've actually felt a small, real version of this. Think about a moment of genuine panic, a near-car accident, a sudden fall. Many people describe those seconds as stretching out, as if the world downshifted into slow motion. Psychologist David Eagleman, who has spent years studying subjective time perception, ran experiments dropping volunteers from significant heights to test whether time genuinely slows during fear, or whether it only feels that way in memory afterward. His findings were clear. Time doesn't actually slow down. What changes is how densely your brain records the experience. Fear triggers a flood of adrenaline that causes a nearby brain structure, the amygdala, to lay down memories far more densely than usual. When you look back on the moment later, the sheer density of detail makes it feel like it took longer than it did. Which means the Sharingan's slowed time wouldn't actually be slowing anything down in the moment. It would only feel that way in retrospect, which is completely useless in the middle of a fight. You can't dodge a punch based on a memory you haven't formed yet. Or an ability to genuinely help you react faster in real time. Your visual system would need to shorten the delay between light hitting your retina and your motor cortex issuing a command to your muscles. A pipeline that's already remarkably optimized by millions of years of evolution. Compressing it further runs into the same wall as everything else in this list. More speed demands more energy demands more heat, and more heat damages the very tissue doing the processing. There's also the matter of progression because the Sharingan isn't described as one fixed ability. It escalates, 1 tomoe, 2, 3, then for a rare few the Mangekyo, and finally obtained through even greater cost the Eternal Mangekyo. Looked at through a biological lens, this progression is oddly familiar because it mirrors something real neuroscience already understands well: cumulative damage. Pathologist Anne McKee's research on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the degenerative brain condition found in athletes who endure repeated head trauma, showed something crucial. The damage isn't caused by one single catastrophic event. It builds gradually, injury layered on top of injury, each one individually survivable but collectively devastating over time. Early-stage damage might show almost no visible symptoms at all. By the time obvious symptoms appear, the underlying tissue has often already been deteriorating for years. Now map that same pattern onto the Sharingan's escalating tomoe. A single tomoe used sparingly might represent something like a minor, mostly recoverable strain on the retina and visual cortex, similar to eye fatigue after staring at a bright screen too long. 2 tomoe used more aggressively would represent a meaningfully larger cumulative load. By the time you reach 3 tomoe, you're not dealing with fresh strain anymore. You're stacking new damage on top of tissue that never fully recovered from the last activation. The Mangekyo Sharingan is explicitly described, even within the show's own internal logic, as requiring profound emotional trauma to unlock, and its use is shown directly damaging eyesight with repeated activations. Biologically, that tracks disturbingly well. You'd essentially be looking at a visual system pushed so far past its baseline capacity that each subsequent use isn't adding a new ability so much as spending down a shrinking reserve of healthy tissue that has no realistic way to regenerate at the rate it's being consumed. And the Eternal Mangekyo, the final stage, obtained in the story only by transplanting a sibling's eyes to halt the deterioration entirely. That detail is, again, accidentally the most scientifically honest part of the entire concept. It's the story acknowledging in its own dramatic language that the tissue damage from earlier stages was never fully reversible. The only fix the narrative can offer is replacing the failing organ altogether, which is precisely what happens in real medicine when a biological structure degrades past the point self-repair can keep up with. So the escalating power of the Sharingan, the exact thing that makes it feel more thrilling with each new phase, is simultaneously a slow-motion record of accumulating, irreversible harm. The more dramatic the ability becomes on screen, the more damaged the organ producing it would actually be underneath. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This isn't some strange edge case unique to a fictional eye. It's a preview of a trade-off embedded in your own biology right now. Every cognitive shortcut your brain takes to make you faster or sharper in one area comes from resources borrowed from somewhere else. Elite chess players who train intense pattern recognition show measurably different resource allocation in their visual and memory systems compared to non-players, a trade-off, not a pure upgrade. Your brain has never been a system with infinite headroom. It's a system that's constantly negotiating. Which is exactly why watching a power like this on screen feels so thrilling anyway, even though none of it holds up. Because your brain isn't evaluating the Sharingan for biological plausibility while you watch. It's responding to a much older, simpler craving, the fantasy of seeing everything before it happens, of never being caught off guard again. Evolutionarily, threat prediction was one of the most valuable skills a human could have. A power that promises perfect foresight taps directly into that ancient wiring, regardless of what it would actually cost a real nervous system to deliver. But now you know what's actually hiding behind those spinning red eyes. Not effortless mastery, a brain overheating itself in real time, synapses being violently rewritten faster than biology allows, retinal blood vessels straining past their breaking point with every extended use. So the next time you see those eyes bleed red on screen, look a little closer, not at the power, at the cost quietly written into the design the whole time, a cost the show only pretended was optional. You've seen it activate 100 times, now you know what it would actually mean if it ever really did.